The diencephalon contains the third ventricle. Its lateral walls are grooved by the hypothalamic sulcus, which divides the area into two parts. The dorsal part comprises the dorsal thalamus, metathalamus, and the epithalamus. The ventral part contains the ventral or subthalamus and the hypothalamus. The dorsal thalamus, or simply the thalamus, is the focus for most of the sensory pathways. It comprises two oval masses of grey matter, one on each side of the third ventricle, usually joined by the interthalamic connection. It has a narrow anterior end behind the interventricular foramen, and an expanded posterior part, the pulvina. The thalamus is almost surrounded by a layer of white matter, the stratum zonale above, and the external medullary lamina laterally. The internal medullary lamina separates the thalamus into three parts, anterior, medial, and lateral, each containing a group of nuclei. Within the lamina itself are the intralaminar nuclei. They are closely associated with the reticular formation and influence the level of cortical activity or arousal. The anterior nuclei are associated with the limbic system and are involved in mood and memory. They receive fibers from the mammillary bodies in the mammillothalamic tract and send efferents to the cingulate gyrus and the hypothalamus. Korsakoff's syndrome, a severe disturbance of short-term memory, may involve lesions of the mammillothalamic tract.
As soon as the music started, Clive's professional personality was unaccountably restored, and a casual observer would hardly suspect that large parts of his memory are virtually non-existent. And yet when the music stops, he is left high and dry, and he often improvises or confabulates an imaginary past, as if to make up for the one he has forgotten.
Thank you all. It's lovely. I waved, you sang.
You've been very well trained.
Have I been conducting before?
Oh, yes.
I didn't know that. Just today is the first time I've actually been conscious of doing anything at all. How extraordinary.
How long does the gap have to be for him to be surprised by your return?
Between 10 and 15 minutes. Now.
Very few human beings I suspect will have it.
Darling!
The medial part of the thalamus is occupied mostly by the dorsomedial nucleus, which is connected with the prefrontal cortex and the hypothalamus. It may be responsible for the effect of sensory stimuli on the mood. A lesion here causes changes in personality, drive, and intellectual capacity. The lateral group of thalamic nuclei lie in two tiers, dorsal and ventral. The ventral group includes the ventral anterior nucleus, which receives information from the substantia nigra, the corpus striatum, and the premotor cortex. The ventral lateral nucleus is connected in addition to the cerebellum and the red nucleus. Both nuclei probably influence the motor cortex. The ventral posteromedial nucleus receives trigeminal and gustatory pathways, and the ventral posterolateral nucleus sensory information which ascends in the medial and spinal lemnisci. Both ventral posterior nuclei are connected to the primary sensorimotor cortex. Damage to the posterior nuclei may cause loss of all forms of sensation, two-point discrimination, localization of touch, joint position sense, and stereoagnosis. The thalamic syndrome, sudden spontaneous attacks of severe unprovoked pain on the opposite side of the body, may also result.
All there and there and there was hell. Yeah, hell.
You could see it on his face, and no matter what position or what you did for him, it just seemed to make it worse. Even when he was lying down, we put him to relax on the bed. He used to say the words he could get out was "chop it off," or "I want to die."
Scroogian, plain, terrible.
The dorsal group connect with other thalamic nuclei and with the parietal, occipital and temporal lobes and the cingulate gyrus. The pulvinar connects with Wernicke's speech area and may be involved with control of speech and eye movements and the perception of chronic pain. The cerebral cortex is necessary for recognition, that is, interpretation of sensory input based on past experience, and cortical projections form a large part of the corona radiata and the internal capsule, although some forms of crude sensation can be appreciated at thalamic level. The metathalamus comprises the medial and lateral geniculate bodies, two small swellings on the undersurface of the thalamus on either side of the midbrain. The lateral geniculate bodies are an integral part of the visual pathway, which begins in the retinae. Axons of the ganglionic layer converge on the optic discs and leave the eyeballs as the optic nerves, the second cranial nerves. They unite at the anterior end of the third ventricle in a flat bundle called the optic chiasma. Here, fibers from the nasal halves cross the midline, and fibers from the temporal half of each retina pass backwards on the same side. From the posterior angles of the chiasma, the optic tract emerges and passes deep to the uncus and parahippocampal gyrus to reach the lateral geniculate body. The nucleus, which may contain up to 1 million nerve cells, has a 6-layered structure. Fibers from the optic nerve on the same side end in layers 2, 3, and 5, and those from the opposite side in layers 1, 4, and 6. Efferent fibers pass backwards as the optic radiation to terminate in the visual cortex of the occipital lobe. The medial geniculate body forms part of the auditory pathway. Fibers arrive from the lateral lemniscus of the same side, and from both inferior colliculi in the inferior brachium. Efferents form the auditory radiation which terminates in the primary and secondary acoustic areas of the temporal lobe. Behind the dorsal thalamus is the epithalamus, which comprises the pineal gland, the habenular nuclei, and the habenular and posterior commissures. The pineal gland is a small conical structure attached to the thalamus by the pineal stalk. Within the stalk, which contains the pineal recess of the third ventricle, is the habenular commissure above and the posterior commissure below. The gland is thought to be endocrine. It contains 2 cell types, neither of them nerve cells, glial cells and pinealocytes. Sympathetic impulses stimulate the pinealocytes to release serotonin and melatonin into the blood and cerebrospinal fluid. They act on the pituitary, the parathyroids, the pancreas, the adrenals, and the gonads, with mostly inhibitory effects. In animals, the pineal has a circadian rhythm, influenced by light in the retina, and is most active during darkness. With advancing age, it becomes progressively calcified, and its displacement, visible on X-ray, may be a useful sign of an intracranial space-occupying lesion. The subthalamus is a complex lens-shaped region beneath the thalamus. It contains the subthalamic nucleus, the zona incerta, the upper parts of the red nucleus and substantia nigra, and a number of important nerve tracts passing from the midbrain to the thalamus. The upper ends of the medial, spinal, and trigeminal lemnisci, for example. The subthalamus has an important inhibitory effect on motor activity. Damage may lead to hemibolismus, uncontrolled bouts of twisting movements on the opposite side of the body. The hypothalamus lies at the center of the limbic system. It comprises the optic chiasma, the tuber cinereum and the infundibulum, the mammillary bodies, the posterior perforated substance, and a number of important nuclei. The tuber cinereum is a convex mass of grey matter. Its median eminence is continuous with the infundibulum, the stalk of the hypophysis cerebri, or pituitary gland. The posterior lobe, or pars nervosa of the gland, the infundibulum, and the median eminence are known as the neurohypophysis. The anterior lobe of the gland, the adenohypophysis. The hypothalamus is divided into medial and lateral parts by the columns of the fornix. Medially are the preoptic, paraventricular, dorsomedial and ventromedial, infundibular and posterior nuclei. Laterally are the supraoptic, lateral, tuberomammillary and lateral tuberal nuclei. The suprachiasmatic nucleus straddles the two parts. The hypothalamus is connected to the hypophysis cerebri by two pathways. Blood vessels of the hypophyseal portal system transport releasing and release-inhibiting hormones produced in the hypothalamus to the anterior lobe. Nerve fibers connect the hypothalamus to the posterior lobe of the hypophysis. Antidiuretic hormone, synthesized by the supraoptic nucleus, and oxytocin, synthesized by the paraventricular nucleus, pass along these axons to the posterior lobe, where they are released, a process known as neurosecretion. The hypothalamus influences body temperature, the emotions, hunger and thirst, sexual behavior, and certain circadian rhythms, such as sleeping and wakefulness. It controls the endocrine and the autonomic system, the anterior part, the parasympathetic system, and the posterior part, the sympathetic system. The seat not only of intellect and reason, but also of homeostasis, it is the forebrain which sets us apart from the rest of the animal world. The essence of human individuality itself may reside within its vast mantle of grey matter.